Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're going to be making a can crusher. Well, as a lot of you know, I'm always in search of extra projects to use up scrap wood, and this project is no exception. I have a lot of oak that's left over from the roll top desk, and it's smaller scraps that I wouldn't really be able to use in a project, and I thought that a can crusher might be the way to go. So why not? Let's get into it, and I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants on this one, and hopefully it works. So let's head over to the bench and see if we can't come up with some dimensions. Well, first and foremost, the piece that I want to make first will be the working part of all of this, or the business end of the can crusher, which is the platform and the mechanism that will crush the can. And for that, I've pulled a piece of scrap off the wood rack. It's 7/8 of an inch thick, and I've kind of determined that if I get a 3 by 3 inch square, that is going to be a large enough platform that it will crush this can no problem. I don't want to have too much play in this area, because I don't want the can to be able to slip out this way or this way and jam sideways. So I'm going to cut a piece of this oak at 3 inches by 3 inches. Well, I have another scrap of oak that is 3/8 of an inch thick, and it just so happens to be 3 inches wide already, which is great for me, but I'm going to need 2 pieces of this that are going to be 4 inches long. Well, we have our sidewall pieces measuring 3 inches by 4 inches, and I'm going to come down from the top at 9/16 of an inch, and I'm going to place a mark there on that, right at 9/16, right there. And then I'm going to mark it on the center, and half of 3 inches is 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to place a mark there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill a 1/4 inch through hole right at that point on both of these side pieces. And I think the last thing I'd like to do to these side pieces, just to give it a little bit more of a aesthetically pleasing look, is at the top I'm going to put a 3 inch diameter circle at the top and cut it out on the scroll saw. And there we have the sides done with the top rounded profiles, just to make it look prettier. I've also cut a piece from the 3 inch wide 7/8 thick red oak at 2 inches long, to glue in like this, just to give some support to this piece, to make it a little stronger, just like this. And I'll just get a can here and show you. This is the piece that is going to come down here and crush this can. So that's why it looks so beefy, and that's why it is the way it is. But again, we're flying by the seat of our pants here. I really don't have any preconceived notions of this, so this may or may not work. Either way, let's get this piece glued together and put it aside for now. Well, we have the bottom of our plunger mechanism that's going to crush the cans done, and truth be told, I did use some number 6 by 3/4 screws just to strengthen it and give it that little extra hold that it's going to need. This is going to take a bit of abuse. So my idea is that it's going to run in a platform, and this was up in the rack. It obviously was an old piece of the desk. I've got it labeled for something. I guess it didn't get used, but anyway, it's 4 inches wide, and that gives us a nice little clearance on either side. And what I'm going to do is take a measurement with this plunger in place from the back of this upright, which is 14.5 inches long, out to the front face of our plunger, and it's just under 4 inches. It's like 3 7/8, so we'll make it 4 inches. So out of another piece of board, I'm basically going to cut 2 4-inch wide pieces, and we're going to make almost like a cage for this thing to ride in, something like that, but with the boards cut properly. So let me rip these boards here to 4 inches wide, and then we'll come back and see what we need for this travel of this plunger when it comes to crushing the cans. Well, here I have the assembly temporarily clamped up just for test fitting, and this back piece, as I said, was 14.5 inches long, 4 inches wide. These ended up being 4 inches wide as well, but they ended up to be 10.25 high. Now, this is the mechanism here that we made earlier that will slide up and down through here, but we really need a base now to hold it all together. So just take your measurements of what you're going to need. You know that back to front, or front to back, whichever you want to call it, is 4 inches. Now you just need to measure the span across here to get the other dimension. Once you get that, cut it, and we'll see what we can do about fitting this together for a dry fitting. Now that we have the base piece fit into its position, you can kind of see how this is coming together, where you would put your can in this section here, and this piece here would come down and crush your can. Now, there has to be a way for us to keep this from coming out. So for that, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to end up gluing some strips onto these pieces here, almost like guide rails. But before we can do that, we need something to put the guide rails into. And for that, we're going to run a couple of dados in these uprights to coincide with the center of our plunger, we're going to call this piece. So you want to line this up, mark your center where you'd like it to go. Now don't have it tight to the back. You want a little bit of play because, you know, you don't want it to be binding up. So have a little bit of play here, mark your center, and decide how wide your dado is going to be. I'm thinking I'm going to put a 3/4 inch runner along here, and so you want a 3/4 inch wide dado. So mark it out, and then we're going to take it over to the table saw, and we're going to cut those dados to coincide with the runners that we're going to put on. Well, I have those dados cut, and while I was at it, I checked for fit, and I really didn't like the thickness of this, or the width of this backboard. It left for way too much play in this plunger, and I wanted it a little tighter. So I ended up taking about 3/16 of an inch off of it to tighten up the joint a little bit and to tighten the fit. And yeah, we're just 3/16 shy of our 4 inches there, and that gave it a much nicer fit with that plunger. With our dados now in place, we need to do the rails that are here, and once again I'm going to be using some scrap material. Now, if you guys remember back from my coping sled build, I used this the plastic, the UHMW plastic, and I have some scrap pieces left over from the rails on that. And it's no coincidence that I cut a 3/4 inch dado here, because I have scraps of the 3/4 inch wide by 1/4 inch thick UHMW plastics. The dados that I cut are 5/16 of an inch deep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these pieces to length, just shy of our 1/4 inch hole, you know, maybe an inch below. Let's just measure and see. Let's make those pieces 3 inches long. So we're going to cut a couple lengths at 3 inches long, and we're going to mount them to the side of our plunger, making sure that they're dead center and making sure that they're square to the bottom. And once we get those mounted and screwed in place, we're going to check our fit for this assembly running up and down here before we start gluing together any of the actual box frame here. Now I've used a square here to make sure that everything lines up and that it's nice and square to the lower end of our plunger, and I've already drilled this hole. I'm just double checking it, and we're just going to use some number 6 by 3/4 screws and countersink them into this plastic for our guides. So once you get those screwed in, now we can just test them in our dados to make sure that we have a smooth sliding operation for the plunger. And we'll just take the plunger mechanism and slip it into the dados. And we just want to watch it as it goes up and down. Now I'm trying to push it back into the actual backboard to see if it's going to rub or bind. I'm also trying to twist it at the same time, trying to bind it. And it seems to be actually pretty good. I don't see any kind of binding or anything that's going to cause me any kind of problems here. So I can actually go ahead with the next step, which will be to put this whole kind of box together. And it's just simple butt joints and glue. I'm not doing anything fancy here. It's a can crusher, for crying out loud. So I'm going to drill and countersink, probably with some 2-inch screws up into the base here, screwing into the sides here, and glue everything together. And when I get all that done, I'm going to come back and see you, and we'll carry on with the next step, which I'm hoping is going to be the levers. And there we have our housing glued together, glued and screwed. I used number 10 by 2-inch screws countersunk along the sides, and on the bottom I did the same, but on these two back holes here, because of the distances that I had, the 2-inch actually ran into the 2-inch that was into the side. So I changed it up for 1.5 inches on those two back screws, but like I said, we're flying by the seat of our pants. Now it's time to make the lever that will be right here. There's going to be a down lever on this. And for that, what I'm going to do is I want to measure the inside gap here. It should be 3 inches. We want to take off maybe 1/8 inch, give it a little bit of wiggle room. And we're going to need a 3/4 inch thick piece that will be, say, 2 7/8 inch wide. I don't know how long, so I'm going to go at least 14 inches and see how that works. Our levers are going to be quite long. At least this middle one is going to be quite long until we can test it and see how things kind of line up. So for this one, we're going to have it at 2 7/8 by 3/4 inch thick, and let's just say 14 inches long. I've cut the piece at 2 7/8, and the reason that I wanted it smaller is because I wanted to get some washers in here. And I don't know if you can see that, but I've got a metal washer here and one here. And all I've done is I've chamfered these edges here of the of this lever. I've chamfered these at 45 degrees and then screwed it in with some number 10 by 1-inch screws, having the washers in between the lever and our plunger so that we have this kind of a setup. Once we get that kind of a setup, of course, it sits down in our dados just like this. And now this is the one piece that will attach to our handle to allow it to crush the cans. This is actually 16 inches long, which is way too long, but I don't know the actual dimensions until I make the handle, and that is going to be our next step. I've grabbed another scrap of oak out of the wood rack, and you can see it has some imperfections here, and that's why it was a scrap offcut, and that's why it didn't make the desk. But there's a can crusher, I'm not concerned. It's just over 3 inches wide, 3/4 inch thick. I think it's about 21 inches long, just over 21 and a half. And I'm just going to draw out what I think would be a half decent handle. I don't want anything super fancy. I'll make it 2 inches wide on this side, and we're just going to make this round. I'll make that perfectly round kind of thing once I get it shaped out. And I kind of want it to resemble like an axe handle, so I'm just going to sketch it out. It's really not that imperative to have it perfect. And just like that, I mean, that's all I really want, something like that. So I'm going to straighten out this line now that I have the rough sketch of it. I'm going to take it to the scroll saw and I'm going to cut this out. I'm also going to be drilling a 1/4 inch hole somewhere in the middle here, and this will be our handle that we'll use to use it as leverage to crush down on the can. So I'm going to cut this out and then I'm going to come back and see you. And there we have the handle rough shaped. Now we need some mounting blocks to mount this handle, which will go at the top of our assembly here. So for that we're going to cut some more scrap oak 3 inches by 3 inches by 3/4 of an inch thick. Now we've got our 3 inch by 3 inch blocks of scrap oak, and I've drilled a 1/4 inch hole right in the middle of both blocks. I've also drilled a 1/4 inch hole in the pivoting end of our handle, and I drilled that 1 inch in from the end and 1 inch in on the edges here, make it centered on its pivot point. Now we want to take a 1/4 20 bolt and put it through the whole thing. So we're going to put the 1/4 20 bolt and then a washer and then the handle and then another washer and then the other mounting square and then another washer and then a nut, and then we'll have our pivot point. From there what we're going to do is clamp it up here to the top just so we can see where it's going to sit and how it's going to work. And then we have to figure out the length of this. I'll kind of figure that out as I go. Well, I don't think I could have done that more awkwardly, but either way, the handle is in place now. And now we need to figure out where we want this particular piece to be and what size we want it to be. So for that, we need to cut a 3/4 inch groove right down the middle of this. I'm going to use the bandsaw to trim from the end all the way down. I'm going to leave maybe 3 inches of material at the very end. And once I get that done, then I will use the scroll saw just to finish off that last little bit, and I'll show you what it is that I end up with. Well, you can see here now that I've got that slot cut right here, and what I've done is I've used a clamp at the top just to squeeze it to put pressure in on this arm so that I'll have some kind of a pivot point. And I'll see if I can do this without getting in the way, but you can see how this lever will go up and down. And now it's just a matter of playing with it to get our dimensions as to where I want to mount the actual bolt that will go through here, and then I can shorten this upper arm. Right now, the position it's in is really no good for me because, as you can see, it doesn't open wide enough for a can. So I'm going to have to play with that. And once I do that and play with the dimensions, what I'm going to be doing is drilling a 1/4 inch hole right through all 3 pieces, and once again with a long 1/4 inch bolt I'm going to bolt that together, and then I'll give you the dimensions that I came up with once I figure it all out. But it's going to take some playing around, and that would make for one heck of a boring video, even more boring than what this project is for some of you, but either way I'll get back to you. Well, I've played around with it a bit, and it looks like the pivot point will be 8 inches from the mounting hole down here on your lever. That will be the 1/4 inch hole that will mount to the hole in the handle, which looks like it's approximately 5 inches down from the mounting hole here. And there seems to be a pretty good action where you can get it high enough to get your can in, and I haven't tried to crush a can yet, only because I don't have these mounting blocks mounted. And because I don't have them mounted, that is what we're going to do next. So we're going to glue and screw these mounting blocks onto here, but before we do, give your handle a good sanding, and I'm going to use an 1/8 inch round over to take the sharp edges off. I'm going to cut our lever pieces here down to a half decent size, and as well I'm going to do an 1/8 inch round over just to clean it up and make it look a little better. I might also do an 1/8 inch round over on everything while I'm at it, and then once I'm done that and I get this glued together, there's really not much more to do other than mount it and test it. Well, I've got the mounting brackets glued and screwed in place for the handle, and something I'd like to point out is that I ended up shortening this length. It was a 3 by 3 inch square. Well, now no longer. It still is 3 inches long, but it's only 2 1/4 inches wide. And the reason for that is that the lower arm was interfering, or the brackets were interfering with that lower arm. So just something to keep in mind. You may want to shorten yours to 2 1/4. Well, another one of those problems with a fly by the seat of your pants build, and that would be after I filmed that last segment, I realized that I couldn't get the plunger in because the mounting blocks up here were in the way. So luckily for me, the glue wasn't dry, and I was able to break it out of there, take the screws out, and get that plunger in before everything had set. So something to keep in mind for you guys, and that is to get the plunger in place before you glue in these top mounting blocks, because if you don't, you sure as heck are not getting that plunger in afterwards. And with the whole thing now fully assembled, I'm just going to mount it to the wall on a stud, and we'll take this thing for a test spin and see exactly how well or how poorly it works. Well, I've got it mounted on the wall, and it's time for the maiden voyage. I haven't tried a can in it yet, so this could either be really successful or really funny. But either way, here we go. So the handle gets lifted up, you put your pop can in your little area there and just pull down. And it appears that it works quite well. Crushes them up rather good, and it felt pretty solid actually. No worries, I'd call this a success. And there you have it. A can crusher. Guys, this is just a fun little project to use up some scrap. I used oak because that's what I had, and you saw in the segment just before this, it actually does a good job of crushing them up, and it feels really solid. So I'm kind of pleased with it, considering that I just kind of flew by the seat of my pants. And you might want to make sure your cans are empty before you crush them, because I got stuff leaking out of these ones. Anyway, no big deal. Guys, it's a great little project, a lot of fun. Use up some scrap in your shop. If you've got a use for one of these, why not? Make one, give it a try, and have some fun crushing up the cans, and use up a little less room in that recycling bin of yours. Guys, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.